there are artists who become famous, and then there are artists who become mythological. Benny Andersson belongs to the second category. For 5 decades, his name has been attached to some of the most recognizable music ever committed to tape. Melodies so deeply embedded in the collective memory of multiple generations that they feel less like songs and more like emotional furniture. Always present, always familiar, impossible to imagine life without. Yet despite all of that, despite the record sales and the awards and the global phenomenon that ABBA became, Benny Andersson has spent most of his life being the most important person in the room that nobody was quite looking at. Now, at 78, something has shifted. The man who spent decades deflecting, underplaying, and quietly retreating behind his piano has begun to speak with a candor that feels genuinely earned. The kind of honesty that only becomes possible when you've lived long enough to stop caring about managing your image and start caring about telling the truth. What he has confirmed, in interviews and reflections over recent years, is something that attentive fans and curious observers had long suspected, but never quite had the language to articulate. That ABBA's music was never simply entertainment. It was documentation. It was therapy. It was, in the most literal sense, the sound of 4 people trying to hold themselves together while the world watched them shine. What Benny has finally given us, at this late and luminous stage of his life, is not a scandal. It is something rarer and more valuable than that. It is the truth. To understand what Benny Andersson has confirmed, you first have to understand who he was long before the fame arrived to complicate everything. He was born on December 16, 1946, in Stockholm, Sweden, into a family where music was not a career aspiration, but simply the texture of everyday life. His father and grandfather both played the accordion, and from his earliest years, Benny absorbed music the way other children absorb language, not as a skill to be practiced, but as a natural mode of understanding the world. He was not groomed for stardom. He was not pushed toward the stage by ambitious parents or pointed at fame as a destination. He simply played. He listened. He developed, through years of private engagement with melody and harmony, an intuitive understanding of how music worked emotionally, not theoretically, but in the gut, in the chest, in that place where feeling lives before it becomes thought. This was the foundation on which everything else would eventually be built, and it is why, even at the height of ABBA's commercial peak, Benny's contribution always felt different in character from that of a standard pop songwriter. He wasn't crafting product. He was translating interior experience into sound. By his teenage years, he was performing with a band called the Hepstars, one of Sweden's most popular groups during the mid-1960s. The experience taught him the mechanics of the music industry, recording studios, touring schedules, the management of creative relationships under pressure. But more importantly, it taught him that he was most alive when he was composing, when he was alone or in close collaboration with one other person, building something from nothing. The noise of fame interested him far less than the quiet of creation. It was through this world that he eventually found his way to Björn Ulvaeus, and through Björn, to the 2 women who would transform all of their lives beyond recognition. When people think about ABBA, they tend to think about Agnetha and Frida, their voices, their presence, the sheer visual impact of those extraordinary stage costumes. This is entirely understandable. The 2 singers were the emotional face of the group, the conduit through which the music reached its audience. But Benny has spent his later years gently, persistently correcting a misunderstanding that he allowed to go unchallenged for too long. The music itself, the architecture beneath the voices, was his. The collaboration between Benny and Björn was one of the great creative partnerships in pop history, comparable in its productivity and distinctiveness to Lennon and McCartney or Jagger and Richards. Björn brought language, the narratives, the images, the stories that gave the songs their surface meaning. Benny brought the emotional landscape beneath those words. He constructed the chord progressions that created a sense of unresolved longing even in songs that were ostensibly about joy. He layered harmonies with a sophistication that disguised itself as simplicity. He understood, perhaps better than any of his contemporaries, that the most powerful thing a pop song can do is make a listener feel something they cannot name. What he has confirmed in recent years is that this emotional architecture was never abstract. He was not engineering feelings in the abstract. He was pouring his own. Every chord that unfolded with unexpected sadness, every melody that reached toward something just beyond its grasp, every musical resolution that arrived a beat later than the ear expected. These were Benny's interior life translated into frequency and rhythm. The music sounded universal because it was personal. That is always how it works. In the studio, this meant an almost obsessive dedication to getting the feeling exactly right. Not the sound, not the production value, but the feeling. There are accounts of sessions stretching across entire days focused on a single passage, a single transition. Benny was not a perfectionist in the technical sense. He was not chasing flawlessness. He was chasing honesty. And when the two were in conflict, honesty always won. ABBA's commercial peak ran roughly from 1974, when they won the Eurovision Song Contest with Waterloo, through to the early 1980s, when the band quietly dissolved without any formal announcement. During those years, they released a catalog of songs that became so thoroughly absorbed into global popular culture that it became almost impossible to hear them as anything other than cheerful, frictionless pop. That was the misunderstanding Benny has spent his later years correcting. The songs were not cheerful. Or rather, they were cheerful in the way that a smile worn under difficult circumstances is cheerful. Technically accurate, but emotionally complex. The Winner Takes It All, which many consider the greatest piece of music ABBA ever recorded, is a study in devastation delivered with such melodic grace that listeners could almost miss how completely it was breaking their hearts. One of Us is a song about the aftermath of love so precisely observed that it suggests its author knew that territory from inside. Even Dancing Queen, the track most people would identify as the band's most uncomplicated celebration, carries within its arrangement a quality of transience, of a moment that cannot last, that gives it an emotional weight most pure celebration songs entirely lack. Benny has confirmed what the more attentive listeners always suspected. These songs were not observations from a comfortable distance. They were dispatches from inside the experience. The marriages within ABBA, Benny and Frida, Bjorn and Agnetha, were fracturing during the period when the band was producing its most enduring music. The creative partnership was at its most intense precisely when the personal relationships were at their most painful. And Benny used the one language available to him, the language of music, to say everything he could not say directly. He has spoken about using composition as a way of processing emotions that he had no other means of expressing. When asked about confrontation, about the difficult conversations that might have been had during those years, his answer is consistent. The conversations happened in the music. Every arrangement was a message. Every chord change was a sentence in a letter he was writing to people who were sitting across the room from him. There is another truth that Benny has confirmed with increasing frankness, and it is one that carries a particular kind of quiet sadness. Despite being the primary architect of one of the most successful musical operations in history, he spent most of ABBA's active years being functionally invisible to the wider public. The cameras found Agnetha and Frida. The magazines wanted the singers. The cultural conversation around ABBA focused on the women's beauty, their fashion, their personal lives, their voices. Benny and Bjorn were acknowledged as the men behind the music in the same tone of voice one might use to acknowledge the engineer who designed a bridge that everyone is busy admiring. This was not, Benny has been careful to clarify, a source of resentment toward his bandmates. Agnetha and Frida did not construct the dynamic that placed them in the spotlight and kept the two men in the background. The music industry and the media did that, operating according to their own logic of what was visually and narratively interesting. But the invisibility had a cost that Benny is only now comfortable articulating. He felt, throughout much of ABBA's commercial peak, like a man speaking a language that very few people around him were actually listening to. The songs were heard. The music was celebrated. But the person making the music, the specific emotional intelligence and creative vision that gave the songs their character, was treated as essentially anonymous. Reviews called the music catchy. Journalists described it as brilliant pop. What almost nobody said, at least not in the mainstream conversation, was that it was also deeply serious, deeply personal, and deeply sad in ways that the surrounding glamour and commerciality had obscured. Benny read those reviews looking for evidence that someone had heard what he was actually saying. By his own account, he mostly looked in vain. Benny Andersson and Annie Fridlingstad, Frida, were together for over a decade, married in 1978 and divorced in 1981. Their relationship has become one of the defining stories of ABBA's history, not because it ended dramatically, but because of what Benny has since said about how it worked and why it ultimately didn't. Their connection, by his own account, was forged in music before it was forged in anything else. They met in the creative environment of the studio, and it was there that they understood each other most completely. Frida brought to their relationship an emotional openness and expressiveness that Benny, shaped by a childhood in which feelings were processed privately rather than shared, found both magnetic and genuinely difficult to meet. Where Frida felt loudly and communicated directly, Benny felt privately and communicated through composition. She needed presence. He offered art. These are not incompatible qualities in two people, but they require conscious effort to bridge, and Benny has confirmed that he did not always make that effort. He was more emotionally available inside a recording session than he was in the conversations that happened after the studio lights went down. The music said everything. The man behind the music said comparatively little. He has spoken about this with a self-awareness that is striking precisely because it comes without self-pity or self-justification. He does not frame his emotional reticence as a character flaw that victimized Frida. He frames it as a limitation he carried, a way of being in the world that served his creativity brilliantly and his personal relationships far less so. Music was his shelter as much as it was his expression. When things became difficult, he went to the piano. The piano always knew what to do. The rest of life was less reliably navigable. ABBA did not end with a fight. There was no public announcement, no dramatic press conference, no final concert billed as a farewell. The band simply stopped. Benny has described this ending as one of the strangest experiences of his professional life, not because it was painful in any obvious, acute way, but because its lack of ceremony made it difficult to process. Things that end without ceremony are difficult to grieve. And Benny, by his own admission, took years to understand that grief was what he was carrying. The creative exhaustion that preceded the end was real. The emotional exhaustion was equally real. By the early 1980s, both marriages had dissolved. The personal relationships that had provided the emotional raw material for the music were restructuring themselves into something new and uncharted. The band that had been, among other things, a container for all of that feeling had no obvious reason to continue. And so it didn't. What followed, for Benny, was a long period of reconstruction that happened largely out of public view. He threw himself into theater, composing the score for Chess, and later for Christina Fran de Vemela, two projects that allowed him to work with the same emotional seriousness that had characterized his ABBA work, but without the commercial machine that surrounded it. These were projects undertaken on his own terms, at his own pace, in pursuit of his own artistic standards. They were also, by his account, a form of therapy, a way of working through everything that had accumulated during the ABBA years without the pressure of a global audience waiting for the result. There is something about a certain age that changes the relationship between a person and their own history. The defensive impulses that characterized earlier decades, the need to protect reputations, manage narratives, preserve relationships, begin to yield to something quieter and more fundamental. The desire to be understood. To tell the truth not because it serves any practical purpose, but because truth, at this stage, is its own sufficient reason. This is where Benny Andersson finds himself at 78. He is not rewriting history. He is not settling scores or seeking sympathy. He is doing something both simpler and more difficult than any of that. He is looking back at a life of extraordinary creative achievement and extraordinary personal complexity and saying, here is what it actually was. Here is what was really happening behind the music you loved. Here is the human being who made it. What he has confirmed is that ABBA's music was never separate from ABBA's pain. The joy and the sadness were not in opposition. They were the same thing, experienced simultaneously, expressed through the only medium Benny fully trusted. The songs were celebrations and confessions at once. The harmonies that made the world feel briefly, gloriously coherent were built by people whose own lives were, in the same period, beautifully incoherent. He has also confirmed something about creativity that artists rarely say plainly, that the work does not redeem the suffering that generates it, but it does transform it into something that outlasts the individual life. The pain that went into those songs is long since metabolized. The songs remain. They will remain long after everyone who made them is gone, carrying their emotional truth forward into a future that had nothing to do with the recording studio in Stockholm, where a man sat at a piano, working through his feelings the only way he knew how. At 78, Benny Andersson has given us the final piece of the picture that we were always looking at without fully seeing. ABBA was not a fairy tale. It was not a perfect pop machine staffed by happy, frictionless people. It was something far more interesting. A group of deeply human individuals whose personal struggles, creative tensions, and emotional limitations were the very source of the music's extraordinary power. What Benny has confirmed is what the best listeners always sensed in the songs, that someone was telling the truth in there. That beneath the disco lights and the iconic costumes and the relentless commercial success, there was a real person, working at a piano, trying to make sense of love and loss and the passage of time in the only language that felt adequate to the task. We knew it all along, in the way we know things from music before we can explain them in words. Now, we finally have the confirmation. And the music, which was always honest, sounds even more extraordinary for it.